You learned that the U.S. entered World War I because of German submarines, or the Zimmermann telegram. That's the surface story. But the real engine of the American war wasn't in the Atlantic. It was in the vaults of Wall Street. By 1917, the Allies were stuck with a colossal debt to the U.S., about $2.3 billion in loans, spearheaded by J.P. Morgan. If the Allies lost, Wall Street would collapse. Congress, through the Nye Committee, proved that the U.S. entry into the war was a desperate move to protect the ledger of a handful of bankers. Stick around, because we're going to expose how a secret $500 million loan turned imperial debt into a global carnage, and how that very same logic still dominates foreign policy today. To understand the depth of Wall Street's play, we have to go back to 1914 and the collapse of the gold standard. This is Act 1 that makes everything else possible. Remember, gold was the invisible handcuff that prevented war from being financed for too long. Gold was finite, imperial ambitions were not. When the handcuff was broken by all powers in August 1914, the limit to the carnage became only the limit of credit. Great Britain and France needed everything to sustain the war machine in the trenches: steel for ammunition, explosives, wheat, rubber, even cotton uniforms. Europe was drowning in mud and shortages, and who was the only one with the industrial capacity to supply this and the capital to finance it? The United States. But here is the first and crucial obstacle. The U.S. had a strict policy of neutrality that prohibited loans to belligerent nations. President Wilson, a scholar and idealist, was genuinely convinced that the U.S. should remain morally above the fray, staying neutral. But money speaks louder than international law, and it screams loudest when it's being orchestrated in the corridors of Wall Street. What happened next was a slow but deliberate erosion of American neutrality, step by step, driven by one force: the protection of capital. The central character, the figure who tied the American economy to the fate of the Allies, is J.P. Morgan Jr. The bank J.P. Morgan & Co. was more than a financial institution. It was the most influential figure on Wall Street, a state within a state. From the beginning of the war, Morgan & Co. took on the role of unofficial and then exclusive purchasing agent for the British government, and later for France. They acted as a colossal clearinghouse. Allied money flowed through Morgan, who used it to buy everything from rifles from Remington to wheat from Midwestern farmers. This not only enriched Morgan with gigantic commissions, but transformed the American economy overnight. Industrial production soared, agriculture was booming, unemployment evaporated. This war boom, which seemed like an economic miracle, had a fatal vulnerability that only Wall Street understood. By 1915, the Allies' liquidity problem reached the breaking point. They had already exhausted their gold reserves, liquidated most of their liquid investments in the U.S., and the British government was literally sending gold bars from the Bank of England on ships, risking interception by German U-boats. They could no longer pay for supplies in cash. They needed massive, unsecured credit. This is where Morgan enters with the move that changed the course of history. The largest foreign debt bond ever issued, the famous Anglo-French loan of $500 million in October 1915. That was more than $15 billion in today's values, a sum that terrified idealists in Washington. Morgan not only facilitated it, but underwrote a large part of that bond, selling it aggressively to American investors, from small regional banks to large insurance companies. Wall Street had officially made a massive public and political bet on the Allied victory. If this was not paid, the crisis would be more than economic. It would be the collapse of public confidence in the markets. This was a high-risk bet with direct geopolitical consequences. If the Allies lost the war, that $500 million and the subsequent billions that would come would be lost. But more importantly, American industry, which now depended entirely on these war orders to sustain its prosperity, would collapse. Suddenly, neutrality, which was a moral policy, became an existential economic risk. From 1915 to 1917, Morgan and a consortium of other Wall Street bankers extended a colossal total of $2.3 billion in loans and credits to the Allies. This is the number you need to remember. It is the turning point. The bankers' money had become the hostage. They were like a loan shark who was lent so much that they can no longer afford to see the debtor fail. What do you think is easier, forgiving the debt or sending an army to ensure it is paid? By the end of 1916, the scenario for the Allies looked grim. France was on the verge of exhaustion. Britain was desperate. Wall Street loans were hitting the limit of confidence. If America did not intervene, default was inevitable, and the loss of $2.3 billion would sink the American economy into a depression. Wall Street no longer just wanted to profit from the war. Now they had to protect their capital at any cost. Morgan Jr. and his partners became the most effective and discreet lobbyists in Washington. They used their political and economic weight to pressure President Wilson, arguing that the bankruptcy of Great Britain and France would mean the end of the American boom and mass unemployment. They whispered that the only way to ensure the loans were paid, with interest, was to ensure the Allies won. And the only way to ensure the Allied victory was U.S. military intervention. Wilson, the man of peace, was trapped by a web of debt woven by his own bankers. He faced an impossible choice: maintain neutrality and risk a domestic financial collapse that would hold him accountable, or enter the war and give Wall Street its bailout. Make no mistake, the Zimmermann telegram and German U-boats provided Wilson with the necessary moral pretext, the patriotic smokescreen he needed to justify what was, in essence, a financial rescue disguised as a war for democracy. The inflection point, Wall Street's master move, was the approval of the war loan of 1917. The exact moment the U.S. declared war, the U.S. Treasury Department took control of the financing. They basically took all the Allied debt securities that were on Morgan's balance sheet and on other large banks and transferred them to the American taxpayers' balance sheet. Wall Street was saved. The $2.3 billion risk was transferred from the handful of wealthy investors to the common citizen, the doughboy who would now fight for the debt. This is the ugly truth that textbooks ignore. America did not enter the war out of idealism or legitimate self-defense, but as a debt collection mechanism for the financial sector. The truth only came out, spectacularly, in 1934, at the height of the Great Depression, with the popular outcry for answers. The stage was the Nye Committee. Senator Gerald Nye and his team spent years investigating the armaments industries and Wall Street's corrosive influence on the war decision. The 4-year investigation was one of the most impactful moments in American political history. They brought to light detailed testimony and bank documents that proved that the U.S. war effort was predominantly motivated by the need to protect the massive loans granted by New York bankers. The report was incisive. They called these bankers and arms manufacturers the merchants of death, individuals who profited from the misery of war and used their power to co-opt American foreign policy for their own ends. The brutal irony, which the Nye report made clear, is that Congress proved that the war was not about a Kaiser's politics, but about a banker's ledger. The American doughboy did not go to Europe for freedom. He went to the battlefield to save J.P. Morgan from a default. If you still doubt the power of money over war, remember, the American Congress, in an official report, named the bankers as the driving force. The legacy of this proxy war resonates to this day. The model of creditor capitalism, where the debt of foreign nations becomes the leverage for foreign policy and the excuse for military intervention, is alive and well. Think of International Monetary Fund bailouts, sovereign debt crises in Greece, or conditional aid given to developing nations. Wall Street's lesson in 1917 was internalized. Control of credit is control of policy. The doughboy was proof that the creditor system is willing to sacrifice lives to protect its investments. This is the architecture of the Pax Americana that was born from this war. The U.S. emerged from the war as the world's largest creditor. Financial power shifted from London to New York. This was not an accidental transition. It was a carefully orchestrated transfer of power paid for with the blood of a generation. The financial cost of the war for the U.S. was $32 billion. And the human cost? 116,000 Americans dead. The final price, however, was the loss of American innocence and the establishment of a precedent. Foreign policy can be bought and sold for the financial sector. The Treaty of Versailles, with its massive reparations, was the final chapter of this Wall Street ledger. It was a reloaded debt trap that ensured that Germany not only paid the debts, but that the Allied powers could pay their own debts to the U.S. The story of German hyperinflation, the subsequent chaos, and the rise of extremism is the story of Versailles' financial failure. The horror of World War I is not just in the mud of the trenches, but in the ink of the contracts that made it all happen. The next time you hear about military intervention to save democracy, ask yourself what ledger is being protected, what debt is being rescued. That's the lesson Wall Street learned in 1917, and that continues to be the guide of the global elite. If you felt that this exposure of Wall Street's debt war flipped your history script, do me a favor. Write NY in the comments if you are outraged at how this manual is still being used. Like this video if you are ready to unmask more historical truths that schools skipped. And crucially, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video where we will open the book on the dollar crisis. Your support keeps these truths alive. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical. The world is moved by more than just politics.